They said I stole from the people I was trying to help, but I remember every face I handed water to, every child I carried through the mud. When the floods came, I didn't think about cameras or credit. I just wanted to keep people alive. Now my name is the one everyone whispers when they talk about what went missing. When the floods hit Houston, the air smelled like gasoline and wet earth. The rain had been falling for days, and no one really believed it would stop. The water rose silently at first, creeping up driveways and sidewalks, turning lawns into shallow ponds. Then, in a single night, it took everything. Streets, cars, homes. By the time the sun came out, the city was no longer a place but a slow-moving sea. I wasn't supposed to be part of any rescue effort. I worked maintenance at a hardware store, the kind of job that keeps your hands always smelling of oil and rust. But when the local shelter asked for volunteers to deliver food and water, I showed up. Maybe it was guilt for having electricity when others didn't, or maybe I just needed to feel useful. I took an old pickup from the shop and loaded it with boxes. Bottled water, canned food, blankets. Nothing heroic, just something to do while everything around me felt like it was falling apart. The first few days went by in a blur of mud and noise. Roads were half rivers, bridges half gone. People waved from rooftops, calling for help, and we did what we could. I slept in the truck, ate granola bars, and learned the sound of silence between the storms. At night, the sky glowed faintly from the flooded power lines. It looked like the world was breathing through water. There was one warehouse we used for supplies, an old logistics building on the edge of the industrial zone. Inside, volunteers came and went, marking boxes, counting rations, keeping track of donations. I didn't know most of their names, but we all shared the same tired look. Every morning, the same faces showed up with soaked clothes and swollen hands, trying to bring some order to the chaos. I liked it there. It felt honest. One morning, I arrived early. The warehouse doors were half open, and I could hear the sound of dripping water inside. I went in, checked the pallets, and started loading food boxes into the truck. No one else was there yet. I signed the log sheet like always and left for one of the neighborhoods by the bayou. I thought it was just another day. That afternoon, a police cruiser pulled up beside me while I was unloading boxes near a shelter. The officer asked my name. Then he asked to see my trunk. I didn't understand at first. I thought he was joking. But when I saw another officer stepping toward the back of the truck, his hand already near his belt, I realized something was wrong. They said there had been reports of stolen supplies from the warehouse, thousands of dollars worth. I tried to explain that I'd been delivering all morning, that my name was on every log sheet. They didn't listen. They just asked me to come with them. At the station, the questions didn't stop. How long had I been volunteering? Who gave me permission to access the warehouse alone? Why were my fingerprints on boxes found dumped near an abandoned parking lot? I didn't even know what to say. Of course, my fingerprints were on the boxes. I'd carried them all week. But the more I spoke, the more it sounded like excuses. The officer kept writing in his notebook, nodding slowly like someone who'd already made up his mind. When they released me that night, the air felt different. I walked back to the truck, parked under a flickering streetlight. A yellow notice was taped to the windshield, a suspension from the volunteer network until a further investigation. My phone had dozens of missed calls, but none were from friends. Just messages from local coordinators asking me not to come back to the warehouse. They said it was better for everyone if I stayed away until things cleared up. I wondered what people would remember years from now. Would they still think of me as the thief, or would they even remember me at all? A few days later, I received a message from a man named Carlos, one of the volunteers I used to work with. He said he had quit after the scandal because the management started watching everyone too closely. He also mentioned that one of the coordinators, the one who oversaw inventory, had suddenly left town right after the theft. No one knew where she went. That was the first real lead I'd heard. Carlos and I met in a diner near the outskirts of town. He looked exhausted, like everyone else who had been through that storm. We talked quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone around. He said he'd seen a white delivery van parked near the warehouse early that morning, not my truck. But the footage only showed the side gate, and the timestamp was off by an hour because of the power outage. The police didn't bother to check it twice. It wasn't enough to clear me, but it was another piece of the puzzle. Someone had planned the theft while we were too busy helping people to notice his and I had walked right into their shadow. After that meeting, I started keeping notes again. Every small detail I could remember. I wasn't trying to play detective. I just needed something to hold on to, something that felt like progress. It made the silence easier to live with. The next weekend, I drove through the flood zone again, dropping off supplies in the same quiet way. This time, I left a note inside one of the boxes. It said only, for anyone still rebuilding. You're not alone. It wasn't much, but it was honest. Maybe that was enough. Winter came slowly. The nights were cold, the air heavy with the smell of wet wood and diesel. Most of the volunteers had moved on to other projects, other disasters. The city was dry again, though its memory wasn't. The marks of the flood were still visible on walls, like the outline of a wound that never fully heals. One morning, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a printed photo, the same security still that had been used in the investigation. The man in it was loading boxes, but now, in this higher quality copy, I could see something new. A tattoo on his arm. I didn't have one. My hands shook as I looked at it again. Someone had finally given me proof. I didn't know who sent it, but I felt gratitude and anger at once. I took the photo to the police. The officer at the desk looked tired and unimpressed. He said they'd already closed the case due to insufficient evidence. When I showed him the tattoo, he sighed and said he'd pass it along. I knew what that meant, another file in another drawer. But something inside me had shifted. For months, I'd been walking through life like a ghost, waiting for forgiveness that would never come. Now I realized I didn't need it from everyone. I just needed it from myself. That night, I drove out to the same neighborhood by the bayou where I had first started volunteering. Many houses had lights again. Families were returning, repainting, rebuilding. Children played in the streets like nothing had happened. I parked the truck and walked through the quiet. The sound of crickets mixing with the hum of distant generators. The world was starting over, and somehow I still had a place in it. I left one last box on a doorstep, this time with no note. Just a small drawing of a river and a bridge. A reminder that sometimes what's broken doesn't need to be replaced, only crossed. The chill of late winter kept the city moving in a kind of slow, deliberate way. People were careful with their words now, careful with their hands. Even the dogs seemed quieter, padding along the sidewalks like they too had learned to measure each step. For the first time in months, the morning smelled less of damp and diesel and more like ordinary things. Coffee from the corner store, bread warming in an oven, the faint tang of a radiator turning on. It was ordinary enough to be almost painful. I found a rhythm that didn't demand attention. Work at the hardware store filled the day in practical movements, stocking boxes, counting nails, answering the same few questions about pipe sizes and silence. The manager had stopped pretending my past didn't exist. He greeted me with a nod that had folded acceptance into an economy of gestures. People in the aisles still glanced at me sometimes, but it was more cursory now, like the way one checks a flood mark on a wall to see how high the water rose. Those marks were still visible in many houses. A faded line at the height of the sink, the discoloration on baseboards. They had become part of the city's autobiography. Evenings I spent clearing small, practical things. A leak under a neighbor's sink, a broken fence board, a loose hinge on a donation box at the community center. Small repairs became a way to move past accusation, without pretending it never happened. The work was honest in the most literal sense. Screws that fit, paint that covered mildew, a replacement bolt that stayed where it was supposed to stay. Someone once told me that the satisfaction of a job done properly is underrated. I believed it then. But the mind is rarely satisfied with the ordinary. It kept circling back to that still morning at the warehouse, to the sound of water leaking from the roof, to the way the logbook smelled of wet cardboard. Nights were the worst, layers of quiet time when memory could smear uncertain things into sharper edges. I would lie awake and play the scene in my head, trying to catch the missed detail, some clue that might make the world tilt back to a truer balance. Sometimes I would find a small difference, a shadow that had not been there, a boot print that belonged to someone else, and for a while the world corrected itself. Then daylight would come and the correction would slide away like mud. One week, a man named Aaron came into the store with a list of basic tools. He'd been at the community center workshops, the ones teaching residents how to fix what the flood had taken. He recognized me from those early days. He didn't bring up the warehouse. Instead, he asked about a particular brand of Silent that was easier to work with in the cold. We talked about material strength and drying times, and he mentioned, almost offhand, that his mother had slept on the floor of that same warehouse for a week, keeping watch over donations after her house was flooded. He said she remembered me as someone who came night after night, bringing supplies. Small recollections like that became the scaffolding on which I could hang myself. They weren't a public vindication. They didn't appear in any column inches or social feeds. They were private, human ledger entries, little truths that stacked up in the dark. One afternoon, a notice appeared in the Volunteer Network's online group asking for help cataloging returned donations. The post was bland and impersonal, but it was work, I replied. I went because I wanted a place to put my hands into something that mattered, not because I expected anyone to look up and thank me. The warehouse where the sorting took place had changed. New locks, newer faces, a sense that the operation had learned to be careful with itself. We worked in silence much of the time, the only sound the rustle of boxes and the occasional instruction. When my hands were busy, my mind quieted. On my last day there, while stacking a crate of blankets, a young volunteer caught my wrist to steady it. She didn't say my name or comment on my past. She simply looked at me and nodded as if to say, "We have all carried something." That small, wordless recognition felt like a reprieve. It was not full acceptance. It was not vindication either. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the simple act of carrying on was sometimes the truest kind of repair. The weeks that followed were ordinary and small in the best sense. I began to understand that life rebuilds itself not through dramatic declarations, but through tiny, repeatable tasks, replacing a rotted beam, sweeping a floor, making small, honest repairs to the lives around you. The flood had left its marks. Those marks were not erasers. They were reminders. But the work continued. I kept my hands busy, and in doing so, I kept myself from becoming a monument to whatever had been said about me. I became, quietly, one of the people who helped fix what others had broken. Spring arrived not with a sudden thaw, but with a slow, unhurried insistence. Green pushed through the mud in impossible ways, grass between cracked sidewalks, a sapling through the ruined lip of a raised garden bed. The city felt younger, as if it were remembering how to be itself again. People wore lighter jackets. Conversations returned to ordinary subjects, sports games, recipes, who had the best coffee, and the undercurrent of the flood receded, though it never disappeared entirely. The things it had taken were still missing, but the absence itself had begun to feel like a kind of shared history rather than an open wound. I volunteered to lead a small practical skills class at the community center. The idea was simple: teach basic carpentry, how to fix a sagging door frame, how to sand and paint to prevent mold. I had done these things for years at the hardware store, and the work felt useful in a practical, efficient way. The class met on Saturday mornings in a sunlit room with a whiteboard and a folding table. People came with weathered hands and careful eyes. Some had lost their homes. Others had homes that would never be quite the same. Their stories came out slowly, in between measuring and cutting and the occasional joke about a stubborn screw. Teaching was different from ferrying supplies. It required patience to show rather than to do. It made me slow down my own hands and see the repair through someone else's uncertainty. But corporate tasks into smaller, manageable parts, to select a tool that would not intimidate, to show how a straight cut comes from measured patience, not haste. The room had the smell of wood shavings and coffee. It had a kind of gentle order. One woman in the class, Maria, had a nervous laugh that came at the end of sentences. She said little at first, but she asked precise questions about leveling floors. She had a small notebook where she wrote measurements and techniques. Her house had been flooded so high the marks reached the height of a working kitchen counter. She had been doing the repairs herself because contractors were expensive and patience was in short supply. Over the course of weeks, she gained confidence. The first time she drove a screw straight into a stud without wobbling, she looked at me as if she had discovered something new about her own hands. Those changes mattered. They were quiet acts of reclamation. Each nailed board, each sealed corner, each painted trim line was a tiny vote toward the future. We worked slowly, deliberately, The class became a pocket of steady progress. Outside the center, life kept altering itself. The logistics company that had bought the old warehouse began accepting local small business deliveries. New faces filled the neighborhood cafes. The woman from the church whose steps I had swept months ago started a small community garden in a cleared lot. She asked if I had any extra tools. I lent her a spade and a wheelbarrow, and she gave me a jar of pickled peppers in return, the kind of barter that felt reparative in a human way. There were setbacks as well. A sudden rainstorm would uncover mold in a house thought dry. A mismeasured beam would need to be replaced. Rumors occasionally flickered up. A passerby, a comment on a social feed, but they were like sparks that died quickly in the rain. The world had become bigger than the single story that had once defined me. At night, I still sometimes walked the riverbank, where the water now moved in an unhurried, reliable groove. The high water marks were visible on the pilings, but they no longer felt like accusations. They were contours on a map that had been lived through. I would sit and listen to the low hum of the city, distant traffic, an occasional laugh, the clink of glasses somewhere across the way. Each sound reminded me that life is complicated. Wrongs can be done and later made right in small ways. People could be accused and still get to rebuild. The river did not judge, it moved. The class grew into a small community of people who could fix what was broken and who understood the value of starting again. We repaired porches and patched roofs, taught a teenager how to splice wiring safely, and helped an older man replace a rotted banister so his granddaughter could visit without worry. The work we did not erase the past. It made the present useful. Summer that year arrived with an ease that surprised everyone. The heat made the air thick and slow, and people learned to move at the gentler pace it demanded. The community center scheduled outdoor repair sessions, bringing work out into sunlight where people could breathe easier and see the results badly. We repaired fences and taught painting classes on porches, the smell of latex and solvent mixing with the scent of cut grass. One night, unexpectedly, a heavy storm rolled through. Rain drummed on the corrugated roofs and gutters. For a moment, I felt the old twinge of panic that had once accompanied any gray sky. But the city had changed in its preparations. Sandbags lined the worst spots. The pumps in low-lying neighborhoods kept working. Volunteers stood at makeshift stations, and a new generation of coordinators moved with a practiced calm I had not seen the first time around. I volunteered the night of that storm, helping to organize transport for supplies to a shelter that took in a handful of families who had misplaced phone chargers and legal documents in the first flood. We packed sacks with clothing and hygiene kits and loaded them into vans that moved like a small armada through the wet streets. The work now had an architecture, names on lists, backup plans, radio check-ins. The chaos that had once been our teacher had been studied and mapped. Unmapped. At the center, a young man named Derek asked if I would help him learn how to secure a tarpaulin over a roof properly. He had never done it before. We went through the steps slowly. Measure, fold, anchor. He took notes on his phone and asked good questions. When the roof finally held the tarp and the rain ran harmlessly off the edges, his face brightened in a way that looked like relief. The storm passed without major incident. In the morning, the streets smelled of wet asphalt and new beginnings. Small things happened that made the difference. A neighbor checking on another, a kid turning his bike back toward home instead of letting it be washed away. I drove back along the river and saw the high water marks glisten. They seemed less heavy now, closer to the idea of resilience than to a scar. In the weeks after the storm, a local journalist began covering community resilience efforts. They asked to visit the community center and interview a few volunteers. The piece was not about glorious rescue missions or dramatic arrests. It spoke instead of collective care, of people who learned how to respond better the next time. It mentioned the classes, the new logistics, the volunteers who returned quietly to the work. I read the article in the doorway of the hardware store with a cup of coffee sweating in my hand. My name was not in it. I didn't expect it to be. The omission felt right. The work had never been about recognition. Some nights I still dreamed of the warehouse, of shadowed corners and the sense of something missing. When I woke, sometimes the dreams left me with a small residual ache. But the ache dulled quicker now. The city had a new muscle, the capacity to bear storms with less damage. I kept contributing to that muscle in small ways, choosing to believe that preparedness and steady hands mattered as much as narratives and headlines. Doing the work quietly had its own dignity. In the evenings, I repaired tools and lent them to people who needed them. I taught a teenager to sand and finish a shelf. I helped a group of retired men strip paint from an old door and repaint it as a donation for the center. The rhythm of these tasks calmed me. There was a quiet joy in watching something used and broken become whole again through patient attention. Years are made of little continuities. You can mark them by anniversaries or by small habits. For me, it was the way I kept the same dented thermos in the truck and the habit of leaving a box of supplies at an old woman's porch on the first rainy day. For the city, the years were measured in rebuilt roofs and in small businesses that returned with fresh coats of paint and cautious optimism. I took a different route one afternoon past the old warehouse. The building had been renovated. It gleamed in a way that suggested efficient management and a plan. Fresh paint covered the walls. The lot had a new sign and a steady stream of trucks moving in measured lines. For a moment, I felt a familiar prickle, the feeling of being in the wrong story. But the prickle subsided as I thought of the people who had crossed the lot during that first brutal season, the families who had slept on pallets, the volunteers who'd sorted donations in the dim light. Buildings change. People do too. On the community center's bulletin board, someone had tacked a photograph of a rebuilt house. The same woman who had once pressed the small photograph into my hand had written on the back a simple note. "We are getting there." The photo was crinkled at the corners and pinned with a thumbtack. I ran a finger over the margin as if to smooth it. It was a small, quiet reminder that not all evidence needs to be official or published. Sometimes the tangible proof of repair is a photograph tucked on a corkboard. One afternoon, a man I had not seen in years came by the store. He recognized me, and we fell into an easy rhythm of workman talk. A question about engine oil, a story about a busted window. He mentioned in passing that his company had been involved in a compliance audit of relief organizations some months back, and that the audit had turned up mismanagement in the early days of the response.